All right, folks, we are back. Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined by my brother, the Gritty Broman. How are you, Brent?
I'm well. Thank you.
Okay, we are back with Theodore Roosevelt on the River of Doubt. I think this is our last. We'll see how far we get, but I think this might be you might get closure, folks, on this story here. Before we get started, I just want to remind you, if you like the show, what we're doing, use the code GRITTY over at Peaks. Get yourself some trekking poles, some gaiters, the new Backcountry Duo headlamp. Yeah?
I mean, There's other things coming soon.
There is. It's Peaks is really putting out some great stuff. So, like I said, if you like what we're doing, check those guys out. Use the code GRITTY over there. And, Brent, let's get into this. So we have Theodore. He's floating the River of Doubt. And here we go. So sick was the former president that when Raimundo Jose Marquis, he's the black guy, right? Mm-hmm. That was there.
Yeah, because J.A. was the Brazilian dude. The rubber man.
So sick that he couldn't lift himself out of the canoe to meet him. Roosevelt couldn't lift himself to meet. This is the first guy they run into coming out of the jungle. His condition, however, did not diminish the old tapper's awe when he learned that the ragged and stricken man he saw lying in the roughest sort of dugout canoe had once been the President of the United States. Astonished, Marquis said to Rondon, "But is he really a president?" Rondon explained that Roosevelt was not president any longer, but had once been. "Ah," Marquis replied, "he who has once been a king has always the right of majesty."
I like that.
Marquis, who was among the poorest of the river's rubber tappers, had no food that he could share with the starving men, but he did give some valuable advice. Upon approaching a settler, he instructed them they should signal their peaceful intent by firing one of their 3 guns 3 times in a row and then blowing on a bamboo horn that he would give them as a gift.
Why can't they just blow it? Why do they got to waste ammo? I feel like the horn is sufficient.
Well, yeah.
I'm saying, like, you could make up some hand gestures and then blow a horn.
It's a great question because I was thinking the same exact thing when ammo's scarce. But no, 3 rounds, Brent, 3 rounds.
You think he's just screwing around with them?
No, I think that, I don't know.
Why 3, though? That seems excessive as well.
The tapper who lived along the River of Doubt had little more interaction with the local Indians than had the members of the expedition, but their fear was not theoretical. Most of the time, the Cinta Larga remained invisible, revealing themselves to the settlers only in brief glimpses in scattered locations. They had, however, appeared to the tappers who lived along this stretch of the river on one occasion, and the result had been disastrous. A frightened tapper named Manuel Vieira, who lived in a hut just below Marquis, had met some approaching Indians with the rain of gunfire. Soon after, the Indians had responded in kind, riddling Vieira with poisonous arrows. After this fact, no other of such gravity had occurred, Rondon wrote, but the rubber tappers did not deceive themselves with regard to the tranquility which they were enjoying. The panic caused by our arrival clearly shows the degree of nervous tension in which those people live, constantly tormented by the expectation of seeing the warlike Indians springing forth from their wilderness.
That's going to make for some squirrely people.
So he rained down with gunfire, and they filled him full of poisoned arrows. So I assume this fella, what was his name? Manuel Vieira. So I assume he's dead.
Poisonous arrows? Yeah.
Riddling Vieira with poisonous arrows. Right? So
riddled.
That
means excessive. Yeah, I don't know anyone who's been riddled with arrows and then is still alive.
Yeah. Yeah. As they continued down the river, the men were as agitated and high-strung as the settlers they expected to see at any moment. The rain began again, filling the bottom of their dugouts with muddy water and drenching Roosevelt. Suddenly, out of the monotony of the river's sounds, the water sloshing against the side of his canoe, the occasional grunts of his men as they dug their paddles into the black river, a roar of elation erupted all around him. The men had spotted another house along the riverbank, and this time someone was home. From their canoes, the men could see smoke billowing from the chimney and 2 small children playing outside. Before Rondon could snatch up his rifle and bamboo horn, the children had looked up from their games, noticed the expedition coming toward them, and disappeared into their house. A moment later, they reappeared with their mother at their side. Seeing his opportunity and hoping to reassure the woman before she panicked, Rondon fired 3 shots into the air and blew heavily into the old tapper's horn. Unfortunately, he wrote, this precaution did not have the desired effect.
Okay,
I don't think she had the memo.
It's a dumb memo. It's literally a battle cry. 3 fires, and then they blew a war horn. Like, all they didn't do was say charge.
So, yeah, it didn't. It makes you wonder, right? So,
I think he was screwing around with them. Hey, bro, let me tell you,
do.
this is what you do.
Here's your horn. So deep-seated was the tapper's fear of the Cinta Larga that when the mother of the 2 children looked at the expedition's weak and exhausted men, she not only saw fierce Indians in their place in the canoes, but believed she had heard their war whoops echoing through the forest. Terrified, she scooped her children up into her arms and fled downriver, desperately trying to reach her neighbor's house, where she knew she would find her husband. Driven by fear and blinded by the rain, she stumbled along a rough dirt path that skirted the river's edge until she tripped and fell into a stream that bisected it. The men watched helplessly from their canoes, their efforts to reassure her only heightening her distress. She succeeded in getting up with her clothes drenched, Rondon wrote, and continued her wild race until she arrived at the house of a neighbor where she fainted.
Well, at least she waited till she got to the finish line. You know?
Poor
They said
woman.
she fell. I was like, she fell in the river, and the piranhas got her.
What a horrible place. As soon as she could talk, the woman told her husband, a rubber tapper named Honorato, that their house was under attack by Indians. Believing that the confrontation that he had long feared had finally happened, Honorato wasted no time.
Could you imagine running out there because your wife says there's Indians and you're taking pot shots at the ex-president of the United States?
He and 3 of his neighbors and themselves climbed into a canoe and made their way upstream, prepared for a bloody battle. As they neared the house, the rain was still coming down and the sun had begun to set, but Honorato could see the fire that his wife had built in preparation for their evening meal, and he could see men standing just outside his door. He and the other men in his canoe silently pulled through the dark water until they reached the bank. Climbing through the soup of mud and half-decomposed leaves under their feet, they sought cover in the thick woods where they could wait unseen until the moment was right to attack.
Don't stop. Why are you stopping and looking at me? This is the suspenseful part.
As the light of the fire flickered over the faces of the men who had invaded his home, however, Honorato began to realize that something was not right. These men were not Indians. This realization and Honorato's willingness to step forward and investigate rather than take cover and shoot very, very likely saved the lives of many of the men in the expedition that night. Stepping inside, Honorato found Theodore Roosevelt and Brazil's greatest explorer resting in his home while a group of starving and exhausted men made dinner over his wife's fire.
Don't mind us.
Rondon is a legend, by the way, up in here, these parts too. Although their first meeting had nearly ended in tragedy, the Honoratos and their neighbors proved to be extremely valuable to the men of the expedition. They were, Roosevelt wrote, most hospitable to their unexpected guests, and as Raimundo Marquis had promised, they agreed to sell the expedition provisions and 2 large canoes, and they helped them hire a guide.
Dope.
Honorato also explained to the men exactly where they were. The River of Doubt, the western branch of the Arapuana, was known to the tappers as the castana, ironically the Portuguese word for Brazil nut, the nuts that the men had searched so desperately for upriver. Even at this point, however, the river was not known to anyone but the settlers and the Indians who lived on it. It was astonishing, Roosevelt wrote, when we were on a river of about the size of the upper Rhine or Elbe, to realize that no geography geographer had any idea of its existence, but after all, no civilized man of any grade had ever been on it. The Honorados invited the men to spend the night at their home. It seemed, as Antonio Correa said to Kermit, like a dream to be in a house again. I have felt that way. And I didn't brave the Amazon jungle, but I've been in places after, like when Ryan and I, one of the pack outs that sort of is the most harrowing for me is when we came off the mountains in New Zealand Southern Alps with, 2 full tar on our backs, all the meat and the hides. Rope. And we descended this river bottom all night. And we had already sort of pushed ourselves to ragged limits for a week but prior to that. And we made ourselves way all the way down. It seemed impenetrable, and boulders. And some of those boulders, we had to drop our gear down like 30, 40 feet. And then we had to slide down these rock faces and land. And then when you get there, it's like there's no going back. And you're just hoping you're not cliffed out on the way out as well. When we got to we finally made it out. It was hours and hours and hours, all night long. Sketchy. And crossing rivers that if you fell in, you die. They're nasty with waterfalls, and it's just
you have a giant heavy pack on.
Yeah, and so Lampers and I are making our way out, trying to be as safe as we can, but we get to the hut because they have all these huts in New Zealand, and I remember we walked in there and there was food in the hut, and we had been out of food, and there's like ramen noodles and like just you're in there was a place to start a fire, and it was like. It just had that feeling. It didn't even seem real. It's surreal to be back in someplace safe and warm after, just days and days and days of, it doesn't seem real, He said, so Antonio says to Kermit, it's like a dream to be in a house again and hear the voices of men and women instead of being among those mountains and rapids. The reminder of all that they had missed over the past 2 months and were missing still was painful. Even the sight of a brood of chicks hopping around the Horonado's simple hut and pecking at the forest floor stirred Cherrie to the core. How nice it was to see them, he wrote in his diary. How it made me think of home. Sitting outside after the first real meal they had in weeks, Cherrie and Kermit shared the scotch they had been saving to celebrate the first signs of deliverance from their journey. As the alcohol slipped down their throats and filled their chests with a warm flush, they looked up into the dark southern sky and saw the familiar outline of the Big Dipper suspended among the other stars. Upside down to be sure, but how good it looks, Cherrie wrote. While the men celebrated their warm reception by the rubbermen and savored the prospect of returning to their loved ones in the outside world, they understood only part of the good fortune that had brought them down the River of Doubt alive. As significant as their own efforts had been in triumphing over the churning river and the unforgiving rainforest that surrounded it, the men remained unaware of the single most important factor in their survival, the decision of the Cinta Larga to let them go. From the moment they had begun their river journey, their presence had been the subject of ongoing discussion and debate within the clannish communities of Cinta Larga that lined the River of Doubt, provoking a range of reactions from curiosity to fear to covetous fascination with their strange tools and clothing. Isn't it interesting? Because we're about to read about their interpretation, because later when they learn, they have a history of what happened from their side.
Mm-hmm. And then someone goes and ends up talking to the Cinta Larga about it.
Right. And so we're about to hear what they thought of the expedition when it came down, because it was legendary for them, too, to see these people show up for the first time. You're talking about two civilizations crashing into each other for the first time. And what the book is laying out is, they survived, but they survived because the people, you'll hear why here, because it was hard enough to survive everything else, but at any time they could have just been murdered.
They were sitting ducks the whole trip.
The ability of the Cinta Larga tribesmen to destroy the expedition and all its members was never in doubt. Despite their simplicity, the Indians' weapons were marvels of efficient lethality, refined over thousands of years of experience to kill silently and swiftly. If their poisoned arrows were not enough to dispense with Roosevelt and his men, every Cinta Larga warrior had a lifetime of practice with their war clubs that were carefully designed to dispatch any survivors with a single savage blow. The men of the expedition were armed with modern firearms, to be sure, but in the dark jungle at night, when the Cinta Larga preferred to surprise their enemies, there was little chance that Roosevelt or his men would have even ever seen their attackers. From the moment they launched their boats on the River of Doubt, the expedition had repeatedly encountered signs of the Indians' presence, passing through their villages, discovering their trail markings, examining their arrows, even hearing their voices. But not once had they so much as glimpsed a single tribesman.
That's creepy.
There's a whole civilization happening that they floated through the whole way down the river.
Thousands of people living off that river.
Tens of thousands of people. And here he is, they're just floating through and not seeing any sign of them. How eerie.
That would, yeah.
A whole world of activity there that's just under your nose that you don't see. Like the other inhabitants of their rainforest, the Cinta Larga had worked for countless generations to perfect the art of disappearing in the riot of nature that surrounded them. For each member of the tribe, just like every other creature in the jungle, the advantage of concealment was a critical tool of survival that was painstakingly conserved and surrendered only when the payoff was large and certain. In a world of unpredictable, resourceful enemies, invisibility was not merely advantageous, but a matter of life and death. A single unguarded moment could be fatal, and the only look that an enemy was likely to get of a Cinta Larga warrior was a colorful flash of feathers and war paint before a swift and violent death. The same preoccupation with concealment that made the Cinta Larga so terrifyingly invisible to the expedition, however, also reflected the underlying conservatism that all rainforest inhabitants must exhibit when confronted by new or unfamiliar events. The survival instincts of virtually all jungle creatures favor flight or concealment over attack, and the Cinta Larga were no exception. Weighed against the uncertain benefits of any confrontation with the expedition, the risks of undertaking such an action and exposing themselves and their villages to potential danger were great. This was especially true because the expedition appeared to be moving steadily through their territory without posing any specific threat. It seems likely that the benign character of the expedition was also reinforced by Rondon's repeated attempts to reassure the Indians of his friendly intentions by leaving gifts for them at every opportunity. Way to go.
Okay.
Way to go,
okay.
Rondon.
You know what? I know for a fact I made fun of him for leaving an axe behind. I'm a big man. I can admit when I was wrong.
From the start of the expedition's journey down the River of Doubt, these conflicting factors had produced a deep division of opinion between those Indian elders who wanted to kill the members of the expedition and those who favored waiting to see if they would pass peacefully out of the Cinta Larga's territory without provoking a confrontation. Given the tribe's tradition that all decisions of war be made by consensus,
so everyone has to be in agreement,
the very existence of this debate became the thin thread on which the lives of Roosevelt and his men would ultimately hang.
Dang.
As the men of the expedition looked up at the clear black sky above the River of Doubt and marveled at the brilliant stars which pointed their way home, they neither knew nor likely even suspected who was actually responsible for their safe passage out of the jungle. In the dark, liana-draped trees that towered on all sides around the tiny wooden shack in which the men fell off to sleep, the warriors of the Cinta Larga, with painted bodies, hard bark belts, and poison-tipped arrows, slipped away as silently and invisibly as they had come. Obeying the timeless calculus of survival in the rainforest, they disappeared on swift bare feet into endless dark halls of leaf and vine. For their own reasons and on their own terms, they would let these enemies live.
So they were following him the whole time?
But where is Julio?
We
don't really know. Julio disappears. He's gone. Did he die in the jungle, Brent?
He got
Yeah. What's interesting about Julio is He was so close to the finish line.
So, like days. Mm-hmm. Like 3 or 4 days.
Yep. But he let his anger and his ego give him the impetus to go and murder someone, make him feel justified in the murder of taking another man's life who was only keeping you from stealing, which you had no right to do. And he let that rage take over. He kills a man and then he runs away. And at the finish line, he does this, and a couple more days and he was out of the jungle.
Yep.
Right there with everyone else and living a different life. And word to the wise, it's like, controlling emotions, building character, all that stuff. I mean, it's so important, and it's so sad because, I've thought about, okay, how did Julio die? Did he go to the Cinta Larga and did they do that? Did he become a tribe member? Did they beat him up? Did he just get murdered? But it's like he's in the jungle with no more food. He could have just
no rifle. He dropped the rifle.
Right. He could have just died from exhaustion, starvation. He could have been poisoned by something.
There's no way he lasted more than a day.
He could have.
There's just no. I'm not even being funny. Like realistically,
piranhas. Well, he could have tried to swim after them, and then he came in. Like
there was freaking what were they? Catfish, basically big enough to eat the man.
Yes. Yeah.
Like he's dead.
So, according to the expedition's hosts, the tappers, the rubber tappers, it would take another 15 days for the men to reach the confluence of the River of Doubt and the Arapuana, where the men hoped that Lieutenant Pyrenees would be waiting. Is he there, Brent? What's your guess?
I don't know. Chances are good. I'm going to say, because once they get to that river, it's still like another month or 2 of sailing to get out, isn't it?
I don't know.
It's a really long time from what I recall.
After they had spent a month and a half alone on the most treacherous and least known stretch of the river, another 2 weeks traveling through the rubber trappers' territory might have seemed like a frustrating but relatively easy journey. If they could not catch food, they would be able to buy it, and if they lost another canoe, they could purchase one from a rubber tapper. What they would not find, however, was a hospital, and 15 days was a long time to keep alive a man as sick as Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, none of the men, with the notable exception of the seemingly invincible Rondon, was healthy. Rondon's like, let's just stay and chart the river and da-da-da-da-da, because he's built like an ox and can't be sick and or weak or anything. He's like, it's just another day for Rondon. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is dropping like flies. Cherrie and Lyra had battled nearly constant diarrhea. Kermit had fought repeated attacks of malaria. Half of the camaradas were so sick with fever that they could no longer work. Even those who were still on their feet, Kermit noted in his diary, were working poorly and lifelessly. Only a few of the men had retained their original physical and moral strength, Roosevelt wrote. Fear, disease, and hunger had driven them to do things that they never would have done under any other circumstances. They had agreed to abandon one of their own to almost certain death in the jungle. They had stolen food from their fellow camaradas. They had scoured the forest in search of anything that might be even remotely edible. Just 2 days earlier, several of the camaradas had devoured some unidentified nuts that they found while they were hunting and had become dangerously ill. As sick as his men were, even Roosevelt himself had to admit that he was in worse shape than anyone else in the expedition. He continued to fight for his life for his son's sake, but he had no illusions about the gravity of his condition, and he had never faltered in his resolve that not a single life in the expedition should be risked in an effort to save his own. If I am to go, it's all right, he told Kajazira. You see that the others don't stop for me. I've the shortest span of life ahead of me, of every man in the party. If anyone is to die here, I must be the one. Roosevelt's condition had become so alarming and his pain had become so unbearable that on April 16 he finally agreed to allow Kajazira, the man he trusted most on this expedition after Cherrie and his own son, to operate on his leg.
Woof!
The operating room floor was nothing more than the muddy soil of the riverbank. Using only the simplest of surgical tools and no anesthetic, Kajazira sliced deep into his patient's leg, releasing a mottled mixture of blood and foul-smelling pus that had collected in the abscess. As the doctor worked to insert a drainage tube, swatting away the legions of piums and boroshuda flies, pium flies, and those are like the tiny flies and then the big flies.
I'm not looking them up.
Roosevelt did cry out in pain, did not. They were attracted by the stench, the flies, but Roosevelt did not cry out in pain or utter a word of complaint. Father's courage was an inspiration never to be forgotten by any of us, Kermit would later write. What a man. It's got to be disgusting.
Every time I think about it, I think of that moose video where you're squeezing the pus out of that moose you guys shot. That's what I imagine.
Dude, it smelled so bad.
Ooh.
Only this, I think, had more blood and more infections. So, you know, I've smelled a lot of dead things. I've come across a lot of gross stuff, you know. And then when we cut open that moose, though, literally the group of us were choking down. Our gag reflex wanted us to throw everything. Like the smell of that was so putrid that it was like you could feel the bile like coming up, and you get a smell of it and you're just like, this reflex to vomit just would attack you. It was unlike most smells I had ever smelled before. It was crazy smell. Infection being, you know, you can smell like a dead animal, even a carcass, and you're like, oh, that smells. But this, the bacteria rot that came out of that moose, that was another thing. It came out in a gallon, 2 gallons of pus out of a moose body cavity when we punctured it, and it had chunks of, it was green-ish, yellow, whatever pus, but it would come out in like oozing gobs, and then it would have floating chunks of like bigger chunks of goo and
coagulated goo.
It was pretty bad. Okay. With each passing day, the expedition situation improved just enough to keep the men's spirits buoyed and their determination strong. They also had the good fortune of meeting a rubber tapper named Barboso, a simple man with a dusky cigar-smoking wife and his many children. That's in quotes. A dusky cigar-smoking wife and his many children, who owed the men of the expedition with his generosity. Refusing any payment despite his own conspicuous poverty, Barboso gave the men a duck, a chicken, manioc, and 6 pounds of rice. He also lent them a boat, doubtless one of his most valuable possessions, and accepted in return one of the poorly constructed dugouts they had made for themselves. 2 days later, the expedition was able to gain another boat by trading 2 more of its dugouts to more rubber tappers that they met along the river. With a local rubber tapper to guide them, new canoes to carry them, and plenty of food to sustain them, what the men needed most now was speed. Although the operation to lance Roosevelt's abscess had been successful, easing some of his pain as well as Kajizira's concern, the former president was still dangerously ill. The bacterial infection had continued to spread, but he had developed another abscess, this one on his right buttock.
Good Lord.
We did what was reasonable in such an emergency to prevent another abscess, Kajizira wrote, but to no avail. Roosevelt's...
What does that mean? We did what was reasonable.
In such an emergency to prevent another abscess. I think they had been draining it and doing other things so you wouldn't have more pockets of infection collect.
Oh, gotcha.
Just wasn't enough. And so a new one formed. Roosevelt's familiar fat-cheeked face and barrel-chested physique looked deflated, as if the journey had stripped not just strength from his body, but years of his life. After months of deprivation and starvation, when the men had finally reached a place where they could eat all that they wanted, Roosevelt had little interest in eating anything at all. He eats very little, Cherrie fretted in his diary. He is so thin that his clothes hang like bags on him. In just 3 months, Roosevelt had lost 55 pounds, 1/4 of his original body weight. In stark contrast to their American commander, the men of the expedition had difficulty restraining themselves when offered food of any size, shape, or origin. They rejoiced when they found a broken-down river store, even though its shelves were nearly empty, and what little there was had been carted away nearly a year before. At exorbitant cost, the men bought and feasted on such luxuries as sugar and condensed milk.
Make caramel.
Several of the camaradas drank entire cans of condensed milk in long, sticky swallows. In this land of plenty, the camaradas overate, Roosevelt wrote, and sickness was rife among them as ever. Last year, I think it was last year, maybe it was the year before, actually, 2020, I think it was. I didn't eat for like 3 days on a hunt toward the end. I just ran out of food. Mm-hmm. And I'd seen Remy Warren do it years ago on a video where he just ran out of food. He's like, I got to kill a deer so I can eat. He wanted to be successful. He ran out of food before the hunt was over. So he just didn't eat for a couple of days. Same thing for me. And I was with Ryan, but I wasn't going to ask him for any food. And Ryan wasn't going to give me any if I didn't ask. So
what was he going to ask?
I wasn't going to ask. So we were at a standstill. So we're out there, and we hike back, and he gave me some oatmeal that morning on the pack out. So I had a little oatmeal that morning. Then we got back to Trailhead, and we had a bunch of food there, and I dove in. And I'd only gone without food really for 3 days, mm-hmm. And when I ate, it took hardly any food at all, just a little bit, and I was sick, and I was like felt like I overate. I felt sick. I could hardly eat much at all. And that often happens when people go, they get really sick sometimes after starving for a long time, and then they just hoard a bunch of food. You can't do that. You got to take your time and eat just a little bit of food after you've, sometimes it can kill you. The only food that interested Roosevelt was some eggs that he found and ate raw in a dingy little shack where the men stopped for the night on April 23rd. Our stopping place, filthy, wet, and dark, Cherrie wrote in disgust. Pigs, chickens, and dogs contend for the place. But spending the night with the animals was better than sleeping in another downpour, and it was worth any price to see Roosevelt eat something, anything. After months of worrying about his father, Kermit was now obsessed with the thought that, after all they had been through, he might not be able to bring him home alive. Concern over Roosevelt's condition increased the next day when the expedition had to halt because of a long and treacherous series of waterfalls. These falls, known to the tappers as Karupanan, began with half a dozen rapids. Their guide could not help them here, and the men knew that if they were forced to stumble slowly and blindly through these rapids as they had done dozens of times before, it would take them at least 2 weeks to push past Karupanan. It was painfully apparent to his men that Roosevelt would not survive such a long and harrowing ordeal. Men much younger and stronger than he had died attempting to cross the Karupanan Falls, and their buried remains still lay at the edge of the rapids, a sobering reminder that the expedition was not yet beyond the grasp of the River of Doubt. The men of the expedition, however, like the men who had come before them, had no choice but to take their chances in the falls. Ahead of them lay either death or deliverance. That sucks. How many days did they say it would take if they tried?
2 weeks.
2 weeks if they had to try to go around them. So they're just going to yeehaw. They're just going to shoot the gap.
Shooting the gap is always the best move.
All right, Brent. Who makes it? Who doesn't?
Well, Theodore and Kermit are the only two that I know that make it for sure. And even then, I'm not 100%.
At the top of the rapids, the men found a store that was owned by Jose Caripe, a man who, in Cherrie's words, reigned as the king of the rubber gatherers on the River of Doubt. Caripe had begun his career as a lowly tapper, but was now, through hard work and presumably hard dealings, a patrão or boss. Most of the tappers along this stretch of the river worked for him, giving him rubber in exchange for tools and provisions from his store. Caripe was exactly what the expedition needed. Roosevelt immediately recognized the Brazilian as his kind of man, describing him as cool, fearless, and brawny as a bull. Not only was he a self-made man, working his way up from the extreme poverty to relative power and wealth, but he had faced down the dangers of the jungle with courage and even bravado, proving himself to be almost Rondon-like in his invincibility, if not in his interests and motivations. When he heard that the expedition was about to pass through Carupanan, and he saw the condition that Roosevelt was in, Caripe proposed that he himself should guide the men to the foot of the falls. They gratefully accepted his offer and were thrilled when he also gave them one of his own well-made boats in exchange for the last of their dugout canoes. With Caripe's guidance and the use of their 3 new lightweight boats, it took the men only a day and a half to pass through the series of rapids.
That's it?
Along those stretches of the river that were at all navigable, Caripe effortlessly guided them to the safest channels. Where the rapids were impassable, he showed them trails that had already been cut through the heavy jungle. The Carupanan Falls demanded several difficult portages, and it nearly claimed one of their new canoes, but in the end, the men lost only one member of their expedition, Kermit's dog.
No!
Treacherous, who wandered off into the jungle while his master was busy preparing to run the boats through a set of rapids. It was a loss that for Kermit was particularly painful so close to the end of the journey.
For real.
But in what had become an all-out race against time, nothing mattered now but getting Roosevelt to Manaus, where his son desperately hoped the ex-president's life might be saved.
Dang.
On the afternoon of April 26, the expedition passed through a stretch of the forest that had been partially submerged. The dark, murky river was still swollen from the rainy season downpours. Swirled around the thick tree trunks, the river swirled around the trunks, left islands in the river. It just looks like it's swollen. Like as you get closer to the ocean, all those rivers combine, that all those tributaries into one big swollen river, and then it's very easy for it to become overblown. Looking into the distance, the men suddenly saw a row of neat tents lined up along one of the banks. Standing among those tents were Lieutenant Pyreneus.
There we go.
And the 6 men of his relief party, who had established their tiny camp at the confluence of the 2 branches of the Arapuana 6 weeks earlier. Since that time, their fears had risen like the waters of the swollen river, as day after day and then week after week had passed with no sign of their colonel and his expedition. When the men on the river and the men on the shore finally spotted one another, shouts of joy rang through the forest, and rifle reports shook the leaves of the sunken trees. Lying under his makeshift tent, Roosevelt pulled himself up with quivering arms to witness his own rescue. What he saw before him were 2 flags outlined against the sharp blue sky. First, the green, gold, and blue of Rondon's beloved Republic of Brazil. Then, fluttering beside them, the stars and stripes that had for so long driven and defined Roosevelt's own life, and whose promise stirred him still.
Hell yeah.
Well,
Epilogue.
Yep. This is the last 4 pages here or so. The epilogue. On the afternoon of May 19, 1914, just 3 weeks after his expedition's emotional reunion, so about 107 years ago.
I'm not mathing.
It says that 3 weeks after they met with Lieutenant Pyreneus on the banks of the River of Doubt, Roosevelt triumphantly entered New York Harbor on the steamship Aden, all flags flying. As he leaned over the deck railing, smiling his toothy smile, waving his big Panama hat, and in a gesture for which he had become famous, vigorously shaking hands with himself, every watercraft in the harbor that had a whistle blew 3 long, joyful blasts. Although Roosevelt's homecoming was an occasion of great joy for everyone from his wife to his children to the journalists who had followed him for decades, the sight of the former president thin, drawn, and leaning on a cane, which he jokingly referred to as his big stick, came as a shock. He was, one reporter wrote, brown as the saddle that formed part of his luggage, but his dark tropical tan covered a face that had lost its youthful fullness and gained a network of new, deeply etched lines. Physically, at least, Theodore Roosevelt was not the same man he had been when he left New York nearly 8 months earlier. Even Leo Miller, who had endured dangers and deprivations of his own during his descent of the Gai Parana, had been horrified when he saw Roosevelt in Manaos, writing that his commander had wasted to a mere shadow of his former self. For his trip from Manaos to Para, Brazil, Roosevelt had been transported to his steamship in an ambulance and carried on board on a stretcher. He had stayed in his cabin for most of the journey, unable to talk above a whisper and eating very little. It was not until the 4th day out that he was finally able to take a short walk on deck, but he had still needed help climbing down the ship's ladder when it reached Para. Once he was on board the Aden, his appetite had improved tremendously, for books as well as for food. Not only did he regain 25 of the 55 pounds that he had lost, but in the 1 week travel to New York, he had read a dozen books. In New York Harbor, however, it was clear to everyone who had turned out to welcome him home. While Roosevelt still had the same fighting spirit, he had lost his legendary vigor. When his oldest son, Theodore Jr., offered his father his arm to help him negotiate a gangway, Roosevelt rebuffed him, snapping, "I am all right. I can take care of myself." Every man present had been ready to offer the same aid, had Roosevelt been willing to accept it. As he limped down the companionway, the impression was strong that the colonel had endured the greatest hardships of his life. That was borne out when one of his friends remarked, "I guess the colonel will never take a trip like that again." After recovering from the gravest and most immediate effects of his illness, Roosevelt had been eager to tell the story of his expedition's journey, but the scale of the achievement was so extraordinary that, to his surprise and outrage, he was met with not with praise, but with skepticism and disbelief. Even before he had left his hospital bed in Manaos, some of the world's most prominent and respected geographers had stepped forward to question his accomplishment. Among the first to plant a seed of doubt was Sir Clements Markham, a former president of England's famed Royal Geographical Society and the man who had sent Robert Scott to the South Pole. Markham, whose area of specialty was South America and who had traveled extensively through the continent, scoffed that Roosevelt's expedition certainly is a very remarkable story. "I feel somewhat incredulous as to Colonel Roosevelt having actually discovered a new river nearly 1,000 miles long," he told a correspondent of the New Yorker. A less eminent but arguably even more famous explorer, Henry Savage Landor, also attacked Roosevelt even more directly and viciously. Landor, who had himself boasted of fighting his way through hundreds of miles of uncharted Brazilian wilderness, a feat that Rondon disputed, now called Roosevelt a charlatan and charged that his trips suspiciously mirrored Landor's own. "It seems to me he only copied the principal incidents of my voyage," he sneered. "I see he even had the very same sickness as I experienced, and, what is more extraordinary, in the very same leg I had trouble with. These things happen very often to big explorers who carefully read the books of some of the humble travelers who precede them. I do not want to make any comment as to so-called scientific work of Colonel Roosevelt, but as far as I am concerned, he makes me laugh very heartily, and I believe all those who have a little common sense will laugh just as much as I." Isn't it funny? Someone does something remarkable, and people can't stand it. The crabs in a bucket. They just got to come out and they just start hating. They're just like, no, if I couldn't do it, you can't do it. Mm-hmm. Listen to this guy. He's like, he just copied me. I'm awesome. And he didn't really do those things. He even got hurt in the same leg as me. What a loser.
It's a 50% chance. There's only 2 damn legs.
Oh, dude. Roosevelt first learned of the attacks on his expedition when he was in Barbados. By the time he reached New York, he was incensed and determined to confront his detractors head on. I can imagine how pissed off I would be. Several American geographers and newspapermen had leapt to his defense, including an editorial in the New York World that growled, "If the colonel says the river is 1,000 miles long, it's 1,000 miles long. We wouldn't knock off an inch to avoid a war." Roosevelt, however, was the kind of man who fought his own battles. As for Markham, Roosevelt told the New York Times the British geographer had unconsciously paid the greatest possible tribute to what he had done. If his expedition had not been one of great importance, Markham would not have bothered to attack it. Landor, on the other hand, he dismissed as a pure fake to whom no attention should be paid. Yeah. They didn't even have Twitter, bro. And this is going on in the papers and everywhere. I mean, humanity's the same. We just have a better
just
tools.
fast-paced newspaper.
It's just like they attack and
Without
they attack,
editors.
and he attacks back. He's fake, and yeah. These attacks on not just Roosevelt's expedition, but his character only heightened the excitement surrounding the speech he agreed to give at the National Geographic Society on May 26. The society, which had fought hard and, in Henry Fairfield Osborne's estimation, unfairly for Roosevelt's first speech on the River of Doubt, had rented out Convention Hall, then the largest hall in Washington, D.C., for the event. Following a dinner at the New Willard Hotel owned by Bell's father, Roosevelt rode to the lecture in a limousine with Commander Robert Peary, the man credited with being the first to reach the North Pole, standing on the running board and leaning into an open window so that he could continue his conversation with the colonel. As Roosevelt entered Convention Hall at 8:30 p.m., 10 minutes late, an usher at the front of the auditorium caught sight of him and signaled his arrival by waving a white handkerchief. The audience leapt to its feet and erupted in thunderous cheers and applause. This was the only hall in Washington large enough to hold the Society's 5,000 invited guests. But it was far from luxurious. One reporter called it dingy and complained that it was ill-ventilated and situated on top of a huge retail market. It was so stifling hot on this one of the hottest days of a notably steamy summer for Washington. As Roosevelt's venerable audience, which included everyone from ambassadors to Supreme Court justices to members of President Wilson's own cabinet, they awaited his lecture. The stench of rotting meat and vegetables thickened the air around them. Also among the crowd seated in the auditorium were George Cherrie, Leo Miller, Anthony Fiala, and Father Zahm. Since their journey had ended, Roosevelt had done what he could for each of the men of the expedition. He had invited the camaradas into his cabin on the Aden, saluting them as heroes and giving them each 2 gold coins as a parting gift. He had sung Colonel Rondon's praises everywhere he could be heard, ranking him as one of the foremost accomplished explorers of his day. He had given Miller and Cherrie each $1,000 for their next expedition and had pledged to raise more. And in an effort to soothe his friend Father Zahm's bruised ego, because he kicked him off the expedition before it started.
Bro, you suck. You gotta go.
But
you gotta go.
He had asked Gilbert Grosvenor, the chairman of the National Geographic Society, to give the priest a special seat on the platform next to him during the speech. Very magnanimous. He's a leader, man. He's not just taking the glory, but he's like going out of his way to make sure that the whole expedition gets some level of reward and attention. Like, he could just suck it all up out of the room, but he's going out of his way to say, these other people were part of this and we're all a team. From the moment Roosevelt entered the hall, it was immediately apparent to his audience that he had yet to recover from the trials of his expedition. The striking thing about Mr. Roosevelt tonight, one reporter wrote, was that he looked tired, that his hands were cold and covered with perspiration and his voice weak. His smile appeared to be forced, and he gave the impression of a man who was being sustained by willpower rather than by physical strength. Roosevelt, however, was also sustained by righteous anger. He was determined to set the record straight no matter what the cost to his health. Asking the journalists in the audience to take careful notes, he snapped, "I want to call your attention to the fact that I am using my term to scientific precision. And when I say I put, and when I, dude, whenever I read what he writes,
because it's almost like he says the sentence backwards.
It always throws me off. I want to call to your attention to the fact that I am using my term to scientific precision. And when I say put it on the map, I mean what I say. I mean that the River of Doubt is not on any map and that we have put it on the map." That's hard to read.
Yeah.
The speech left Roosevelt's detractors mute, despite the
Maybe
miserable
they were just confused.
Despite the miserable conditions and the fact that Roosevelt was so weak that few of the men in the audience could hear a word he was saying. "I sat in the front row and could barely hear him," Grosvenor would later tell his son. "I don't think 30 people could make out his words. Not a single member of the audience left the hall during the entire hour and a half lecture." After his speech, the New York Evening Journal reported the following day, "Any doubts that still linger about the River of Doubt hardly are justified. With a little piece of chalk, Colonel Roosevelt has put the River of Doubt upon the map of South America." Roosevelt's chance to face down his European detractors, from Markham to Landor to every chuckling newspaperman on the continent, came in mid-June, when he sailed to the continent to attend Kermit's wedding and speak for the Royal Geographical Society. As it turned out, Londoners, so he went to UK, to Britain. Mm-hmm. As it turned out, Londoners were as eager to listen to what Roosevelt had to say as he was to be heard. Outside the front door of Burlington Gardens, 500 men and women clamored to get into a hall that already held 1,000 people and was equipped to hold, at most, only 800. Lifelong members of the Royal Geographical Society, each of whom had been guaranteed a seat at the lecture, were furious at being excluded, some even vowing to resign. A zealous suffragette held tight to the coattails of a reporter in an effort to gain entry, and one man burst into tears of frustration. Even Lord Earl Grey, a member of the Council of the Society who was to be given a place of honor on the platform with Roosevelt, was forced, much like Corrine Roosevelt Robinson at Madison Square Garden, to scale a stone wall in order to get inside. I like that, take it, get what you want, Within the hall, every seat was taken, and the aisles were filled with the members of the council and their wives, who were forced to stand throughout the lecture. It was packed. In the opening remarks, Douglas Freshfield, the president of the Royal Geographical Society, concluded by quoting a high testimony to Mr. Roosevelt and his companions. From Roosevelt's most notable critic, Sir Clements Markham, Markham himself had failed to appear, explaining that he was ill, but his note was a gracious, if indirect, admission of defeat. By the time Roosevelt had finished his speech, rich with tales of disease-carrying insects and man-eating fish, and punctuated by his trademark high-pitched giggle, which sent his audience into roaring waves of laughter, nearly all of England had surrendered. Remember, you can read this speech, but you wouldn't be able to watch it or hear it. Mm-hmm. They didn't have the technology then. People want to hear it from the person's own mouth, them storytelling. One of the coolest stories to be heard, right? And you don't have really radio kind of stuff. You don't have recordings. So people, I see a desperate desire to hear speeches firsthand because that's your one go. You can always read it later. It can be transcribed, written down, and then read, but it's not the same thing as hearing an orator, a master orator, deliver, a great story,
Inflection, timing.
Roosevelt had won again. He had humiliated his enemies, defended his expedition, and restored his reputation. However, he still had one insidious foe, the fever and infection that had nearly claimed his life on the River of Doubt, and which now refused to release its hold on his aging and overused body. When he docked in France on his way to Spain for Kermit and Belle's wedding, he had stepped briskly and declared that he had never felt better in his life. By the time he left Europe, however, his fever had returned, and he had to admit to his old friend Arthur Hamilton Lee that he was not in good trim. Upon returning to the United States, Roosevelt got back to work, writing dozens of letters and articles attacking the Wilson administration and giving speeches on behalf of the sinking Progressive Party. In May, the Literary Digest had written that he would have to demonstrate his growing skill as an explorer and discoverer if he hoped to find any remnants of the party that he had helped to found just a few years earlier. Remember, he had split the Republican Party, and he had created his own party, which they had called the Progressive Party. And but then that split the vote, which caused Wilson to win the presidency. And it never really took off, basically. The Republican Party went back into one party again. And we've been a two-party system since the dawn of time. And I don't think that you're going to be able to, with the powers that be right now, I don't know that you'll be able to try to get a real third party that's a contender. I don't know, because, I mean, you never know. But it seems...
Hey, bro, when it comes to politics, anything can happen. Yeah. Trump became president.
The following year, Roosevelt's driving ambition turned from political attacks back to the military, and he became obsessed with leading a regiment to war, as he had done a quarter century earlier. It talks about how he and President Wilson butted heads. It says that some of his family members died. The death of his beloved, Quentin, his fourth son, who would always be Edith's baby, he was killed in battle. It says that loss of his son Quentin devastated Roosevelt. Months after the news had reached him at Sagamore Hill, friends had glimpsed him alone in his barn one day, his arm around his horse's neck, sobbing. Death in battle was the kind of ending that Roosevelt had always imagined for himself, but not for his sons, and his role in urging them to fight and risk their lives weighed heavily on him. Instead of dying in combat or on a remote, unexplored river, the ex-Rough Rider himself was destined to die slowly, ingloriously, and for those who loved and admired him, far too soon. Reminds me of Daniel Boone. He didn't die too soon. He was like 80-something. But the dude should have died 25,000 times before he actually died of old age, basically. It seems like some people just survive and survive and survive. I mean, Roosevelt should have died in Cuba. He should have died in... There were places or times when...
He could have fallen on his face as a child. The man was blind and awkward.
Yeah, I mean, it just... But yet, he lived a pretty intense life.
It's not like they had great boxing equipment. He's basically getting punched in the head.
Yeah, and so 1914, he is when he gets back from the expedition. Early in 1917, Roosevelt had begun what was to be his final physical decline. He spent the month of February at Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan, writing to Kermit that his ailment stemmed from his old Brazilian trouble. Both the fever and the abscesses recurred, and I had to go under the knife. So it's kind of like this recurring infection disease, like something you just can't, your body just, immune system isn't kicking, and...
needs that penicillin.
Right. And so in October 1918, Roosevelt turned 60 years old. Remember, I think they got back from the River of Doubt expedition in 1914. So he just turned 60. Although sick, frustrated, and brokenhearted over his son's death, Quentin, he continued to fight, refusing to bow to the sorrow and grief that he had outrun his entire life. When the young die at the crest of life in their golden morning, the degrees of difference are merely degrees in bitterness, he had written to his sister Corinne. Yet there is nothing more foolish and cowardly than to be beaten down by sorrow, which nothing we can do will change. I said that earlier. There is nothing more foolish and cowardly than to be beaten down by sorrow, which nothing we can do will change. He uses the word cowardly. I think throughout his life, when he was faced with melancholy, depression, and sadness, he's like, to give into it would be a cowardly act. I had said those same words on an earlier podcast with you. Like, I think the same way. Like, as sad as I might be, I just feel like to give into it it's so weak that I can't abide it. You read about people like Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz. It doesn't get darker than some of what they go through, and these men didn't give in to the melancholy, the sadness, the brutality around them. Anyway, a side note. He says, by November, he was back in the hospital, so ill he was hardly able to walk or even stand. When told that he might be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, Roosevelt paused and then replied, "All right, I can work that way too." He returned home to Sagamore Hill on Christmas Day at 4 a.m. on January 6, 1919, 5 years after the River of Doubt. James Amos, the man who had long been Roosevelt's loyal valet, awoke with a start from his chair near Roosevelt's bed, which had been set up in what had once been the family's busy second-story nursery. The sound that had woken Amos was a hoarse, strangled breathing, the sound of Theodore Roosevelt dying. Amos alerted Roosevelt's nurse, who rushed to get Edith. By the time she reached her husband, he was already dead. For the country that he had served and inspired for so many years, and which was still reeling from World War I, Roosevelt's death was as stunning as it was painful. The newspapers the next morning were filled with long obituaries and pictures of the former president, with his famous big teeth and pince nez. But for most Americans, his death still seemed impossible. A man like Roosevelt could never die. When John Burroughs was asked for a remembrance of his old friend and fellow naturalist, he spoke for a grieving nation when he wrote, "Never before in my life has it been so hard for me to accept the death of any man as it has been for me to accept the death of Theodore Roosevelt. A pall seems to settle upon the very sky. The world is bleaker and colder for his absence from it. We shall not look upon his like again." Of the men who had planned and led the descent of the River of Doubt in the spring of 1914, Roosevelt was not the first to die. Just 3 years after the expedition completed its journey, Rondon's faithful lieutenant and longtime companion, Lyra, drowned while attempting to survey the Rio Sebutaba, the river that Roosevelt and Rondon had steamed up on their way to Tapirapone. As the current swept him to his death, Lyra's last act was to throw his survey notebook onto the riverbank so that it would be spared for posterity, a tribute to the teachings of Rondon, who had so often asked him to risk his life in the pursuit of a greater cause. After his abrupt dismissal from the expedition, Father Zahm, the co-planner of Roosevelt's journey, continued to write about travel to distant lands, but never achieved the fame he had so long dreamed of. To the extent that his family name was to make headlines, it was his brother, Albert, rather than Father Zahm, who was to earn them, becoming a key figure of one of the nation's most notorious attempts to rewrite history. As head of the Smithsonian's Institution Aerodynamics Laboratory, Albert Zahm became a principal proponent of the contention that the Smithsonian's former director Samuel Langley had invented the airplane before the successful flight of the Wright brothers' famous flyer in 1903. The controversy generated by that claim, now widely discredited, so angered the Wrights that in 1928 Orville Wright chose to donate the original Wright flyer to the Science Museum in London rather than the Smithsonian.
Oh, that's some gangster shit right there.
Only after a new regime at the Smithsonian retracted Zahm's claims was the flyer finally returned to the United States in 1948. Yeah. At work on a new travel book, Father Zom himself fell ill and died at age 70 in Germany, and his body was returned to the United States for burial at Notre Dame. Despite the many close calls of George Cherrie's adventure-filled life, he died in bed after a long retirement with his family on his beloved Vermont farm. Yet Cherrie reminds me of what's his name?
Boone?
Daniel Boone. Like just living out his life in retirement for years and years and years on his farm until he dies. It says that after his expedition with Roosevelt, he continued his work as a field naturalist in Southern America for several years, collecting more than 100,000 birds. 100,000 birds over his lifetime. 100,000 birds.
I can't even imagine that.
But the call to Rocky Dell had always been strong, and one day he finally went home for good. He loved fishing for brook trout in the stream that ran through one of his fields, tending his bees and spending time with his grandchildren, who thought that he was the biggest man in the world. He died at Rocky Dell in 1948 when he was 83 years old. Cherrie lived a long time, dude. So Roosevelt died in 1919. And Cherrie dies in almost 1950, 1920, 19, so it's 30 years later almost. Mm-hmm. Only one man in the expedition lived longer than Cherrie, despite the near constant hardship and danger of his chosen career. Who lived longer than Cherrie?
F off. It's not Rondon.
It's the invincible Rondon.
You're shitting me.
Despite the near constant hardship and danger of his chosen career, Candido Rondon lived to be 92 years old, 32 years longer than Roosevelt. Rondon's telegraph line, the central achievement of his life, was finally inaugurated in January of 1915, less than a year after he and Roosevelt had completed their journey. The telegraph line, however, get this, was fated to fall obsolete in much less time than Rondon had taken to build it. Remember, they had built this thing through the forest for generations, cutting trees, putting it in place. The same year the line opened, the radio was invented.
This is one of those video killed the radio star kind of moments. That's hilarious.
Isn't that brutal? It's like you see that throughout history, though, where it's just some new technology comes along and then the old thing is just done, over. Like buggy and car, horse and buggy,
tapes, CDs.
I was thinking horse digital. And buggy, and then the car. I suppose, cassette tapes, digital, CD, and then.
I saw someone pull out a Walkman the other day, and I had to stop.
Whatever.
Someone pulled out a Walkman. I was grocery shopping, and someone pulled out a Walkman and switched the cassettes and kept walking.
Good for him.
My entire I just shut down. I was so lost because
I had an awesome Walkman when I was in Japan in 1995. I bought a Walkman, and the Walkman played cassette tapes, right? Mm-hmm. But it had earphones that didn't have to be plugged into the Walkman.
They were Bluetooth?
I don't know what they weren't Bluetooth, but they
connected.
They
somehow?
connected, and they were wireless, and so I could walk around with my cassette playing without
Japanese
it. But I could only go 6 feet or 7 feet from it, so I kind of had to have it on my person still. Mm-hmm. But
like a cell phone on side of your hip.
But I didn't have to have a cord. It was a big chunky thing, but I thought, holy cow. When I brought it back, because they didn't have them in the U.S., I was showing them off to everybody. And then CDs were invented a year later or so, or took over, and it was,
Brian,
you couldn't buy a tape.
Cassette tapes are awesome. I'm never giving them up.
I ran that thing till it finally quit. It had a rechargeable battery too, which was novel. They never had that either, and it was a little square battery that recharged. Yeah, it was cutting edge at the time. Pretty remarkable. So yeah, Rondon was invincible. He died at 92 years old. But his telegraph line was pretty obsolete pretty quick. Like Roosevelt, Rondon returned home a hero and remained one for the rest of his life. He was hounded by photographers and journalists, invited to meet the president of Brazil, asked to run for political office, which he repeatedly declined, and promoted first general to he got moved up in the military. In the 1920s, after meeting Rondon on a trip to Brazil, Albert Einstein nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And in 1956...
He's killed so many people.
The Brazilian government renamed a territory of 94,000 square miles, nearly twice the size of England, Rondonia, in his honor. In 1958, having explored and mapped more of the Amazon than any other man alive, and having made first contact with dozens of isolated Indian tribes, he died in his own bed at his home in Rio de Janeiro.
Damn.
92 years old. It was almost 1960 when he died. I mean, 92. Grandpa Joe was 92. Sure. Our grandpa.
Yeah.
When he passed away this last year. That's a long life, man.
That's long.
Rondon today remains one of Brazil's greatest heroes, and his efforts on behalf of the Amazonian Indians have endured in the form of the modern Indian Protection Service. When Rondon left the military academy in 1889, Brazil had been home to roughly 1 million Indians. By the time he died 69 years later, fewer than 200,000 survived.
Dang.
So 80% decrease in the population. As the youngest American on the River of Doubt, Kermit Roosevelt might have been expected to carry his father's legacy far into the 20th century. What do you know about Kermit?
This is going to get sad. That's what I know about Kermit.
Yet somehow, for all his brilliance, courage, and youthful Rooseveltian energy, he was never able to live up to his promise or even his own expectations. Indeed, his death was so tragic that the only measure of comfort his family could have found in it was the fact that his father did not live to witness it. The unraveling of Kermit's life began soon after he returned to South America with his new bride. He took a job in Argentina with a branch of the National City Bank, but while building railroads and bridges in wild Indian territory had suited Kermit's adventurous spirit, banking in Buenos Aires did not. As the years passed, the young man who had once shown such promise and had impressed his father with his leadership skills and discipline became increasingly disaffected. Able to cultivate an interest in little other than his wife and his son, to whom she gave birth in Argentina, Kermit Jr. or Kim. On January 6, 1919, Kermit was in Germany with the occupying army when he was handed a telegram sent by his brother Archie, who was home and with severe war wounds. The telegram read simply, "The old lion is dead." Roosevelt had been a central figure in each of his children's lives, but he had been the second son's inspiration and moral compass. Without him, Kermit was lost. The next day, in a letter to his mother, Kermit confessed, "The bottom has dropped out for me. The bottom has dropped out for me." Just as Roosevelt's only brother, Elliot, had been devastated by the death of his father, so did the death of his own father deliver a staggering blow to Kermit. His romanticism and quiet introversion had been warmly reminiscent of his uncle Elliot in his youth, but the similarities between the two men in adulthood were as striking as they were tragic. Like Elliot, Kermit never really found his footing in the world. He could not easily put aside his romantic adventures and ideals and take up his real-world responsibilities as his father had. Also, like his ill-fated uncle, Kermit found himself turning more and more frequently to alcohol to take the edge off of real life. He often drank heavily with his brother Ted, but he was less able to hold his liquor and less willing to stop. In the 1920s, at a party in honor of Richard Byrd, the American admiral who made the first flight over the South Pole, Kermit drank so much that he passed out and was found the next day lying in a corner of the club. Finally, Archie had him admitted to a sanatorium against his will, a rehab center, just as Archie had him admitted to a sanatorium against his will, just as their father had forcibly admitted Elliot to a French asylum after a half a century earlier. Like everything else in Kermit's life, even the great love that he had sustained him through his darkest days on the River of Doubt, did not so much shatter as crumble, slowly eroding through the years of neglect and betrayal. Belle's hard-edged social ambition and Kermit's dreamy, aimless approach to life left them both frustrated and sad. Kermit lost Belle's substantial inheritance after investing it in a business opportunity that failed during the Depression of the 1930s, and the couple was eventually reduced to renting out their Oyster Bay home and selling family jewelry. Perhaps most painful of all for the proud, beautiful Belle, however, was Kermit's open infidelity. He carried out his affairs with the same unencumbered ease and shrugging disregard for the consequences, not only to his wife and children, but to his father's name, which seemed to pervade every aspect of his adult life. Although hurt and humiliated by the betrayal, Belle refused to let go. When Kermit disappeared in a drunken fog with his mistress, Belle asked Franklin Delano Roosevelt, her cousin by marriage and by then the President of the United States, to send the FBI to find him. When FDR committed the United States to World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, she asked him to give Kermit a military commission. FDR sent Kermit to Alaska. It would prove to be his final adventure. At 52 years of age, just 3 years younger than his father had been when they had set out together down the River of Doubt, Kermit's body was so broken and ill-used that he could not do much more than sit at a local restaurant and drink wine. But he talked airmen into letting him ride along on their missions to bomb Japanese strongholds in the Aleutians, and he joined up with Muktuk Martson, a major who had organized Alaska's Tundra Army. On the night of June 3rd, 1943, after making the rounds of Fort Richardson with Martson, Kermit turned to his friend and asked him what he was going to do after they returned to the post. When Marston told him that he was going to sleep, Kermit, haunted by all that he could have been and all that he had become, replied, "I wish I could go to sleep." He returned to his quarters alone. When Marston told him that he was going, he said, "I wish I could go to sleep." He returned to his quarters alone and took out a revolver that he had carried with him during his days in the British Army. Nearly 30 years after he had used the extraordinary physical and mental strength to prevent his father from taking his own life on the banks of the River of Doubt, Kermit, sick, tired, and sad and alone, was now too weak to save himself from the same fate. Feeling the weight of the cold, heavy revolver in his swollen and lined hands, he placed it under his chin and pulled the trigger. In the decades following Roosevelt's journey down the River of Doubt, others tried to duplicate his achievement. Soon after his homecoming, 2 expeditions set out to retrace his route. One was forced to turn back for fear of an Indian attack. The other disappeared as soon as it launched its canoes on the remote river, and its members were never seen again. It was presumed that they were all killed by the same Indians that had shadowed Roosevelt's expedition. Not until 1926 did another expedition, led by an American commander named George Miller Diott, successfully descended the River of Doubt. Diott returned to report that the river was just as Roosevelt had described it. That was in 1926, so 12 years or so after the original expedition, and 7 years after he passed away. As the decades passed, the Cinta Larga Indians became increasingly bold towards outsiders. By the 1950s, they were attacking rubber tappers, gold prospectors, and settlements that had sprung up around the telegraph stations. At first, the objective of the attacks was almost always to acquire metal tools. As time passed, however, the road had been constructed along Rondon's telegraph line, brought in hundreds of prospectors. They just got invaded by people, and they tried their best to kill as many of them as they could to stop them from taking over their homeland. The Cinta Larga's war against the outside world became a matter of self-preservation, a pitched battle against extinction. This time, the outsiders did not stop coming. They shot Indians on sight, dynamited their village from the air, and left gifts of poisoned food on their trails. The Indians retaliated by attacking settlements, riddling men with arrows and mutilating their corpses. It was not until the late 1960s, more than half a century after the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition, that the Indians living near the River of Doubt had their first official contact with the outside world. And it says that the Amazonian Indians tried for years to protect their lands. The Indians kept their wives and children, a clear sign of distrust. Wow. The Indians... Wow. It says, this is kind of intense here. It was not until the late 1960s, more than half a century after the Roosevelt expedition, the Indians living near the River of Doubt had their first official contact with the outside world. So-called Sertanistas from Funai, men who, modeling themselves after their ideals after Rondon, set out to find and pacify Amazonian Indians. Tried for years to make contact, but by that time, too much damage had been done. The Indians did not trust anyone outside of their own tribe, especially not white men. The advances were repeatedly repelled. The Indians kept their wives and children hidden, a clear sign of distrust, and defiantly mutilated a collection of dolls that the men had left for them as gifts. Next day, we found them ripped apart. A journalist following the story wrote, the head stuck on tree limbs, the body skewered by arrows lying beside the trails.
Yeek.
No trust there.
Yeah, the trust is gone.
Yeah. In the years since the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition made its journey, countless battles have been waged in the rainforest that flanks the River of Doubt. To an outsider, this stretch of the Amazon, at least, appears untouched and unchanging, but in the delicately balanced, constantly evolving reality of the tropical rainforest, nothing ever remains the same. Among the most ephemeral marks the men left on the rainforest were the ruts in the thin layer of leaf litter made by Roosevelt's cot as he lay sweating and shaking, his voice fading in early morning darkness as he instructed his friend and his son to leave him there to die by his own hand. Had they done so, rather than resolve to find a way to bring Roosevelt and all of the expedition out of the rainforest alive, the former president's remains would have been scattered along the River of Doubt and used, like everything else in the jungle, to protect and sustain the living. But while the Amazon erased all evidence of the expedition, the rainforest, the wild river that runs through it, and the former president who had led them left an indelible impression on the men who survived. On March 1st, 1919, not quite 2 months after Roosevelt's death, the Explorers Club, a New York society devoted to scientific exploration, assembled at its clubhouse on Amsterdam Avenue for a memorial to the former president and fellow explorer. It included such legendary figures as Robert Peary, Roald Amundsen, George Cherrie. Cherrie, who felt more at home in a remote South American rainforest than he did in the rich, formal surroundings of the Explorers Club, accepted the invitation with the same wry reluctance he had felt when he had been offered a spot on Theodore Roosevelt's expedition 6 years earlier. Cherrie felt out of place at the black tie affair, speaking before a gathering of some of New York's wealthiest, and he was not convinced he could do this topic justice. Stepping to the podium, his leathery skin and rugged appearance in stark contrast to the club's fine white linens. I picture Ryan Lampers here. Right? Like,
Yeah.
Cherrie and Lampers.
Yeah.
Kind of cut from the same cloth there.
Kind of mad that he has to speak.
Yeah, but going there anyway and being like, this ain't my thing. I don't fit in. One of these things doesn't look like the rest.
The large-haired hippie man.
It says, stepping up to the podium, his leathery skin and rugged appearance in stark contrast to the club's fine white linens, gleaming silver and polished wood, Cherrie regaled his audience with the tales of hard adventure that were his trademark and life story. But when he came to the subject of Theodore Roosevelt, his demeanor noticeably changed, and the man who had once objected to camping with royalty struggled for ways to express the depth of his feelings about the former president and their shared struggle for survival on the River of Doubt. In the club's ornate hall, filled with mounted polar bears, Indian spears, and other trophies from across the globe, the aging naturalist became lost in the memory of a distant jungle and a friendship forged at the limits of human endurance. I have always thought it strange, Cherrie said quietly, since I had the opportunity to know him and know him intimately, because I feel that I did know him very intimately, how any man could be brought in close personal contact with Colonel Roosevelt without loving the man. As he continued, his audience of dignitaries and socialites realized that the man before them, a man whose calloused hands had fought off cavalry charges, smuggled guns, and cataloged nature's most dangerous mysteries, had begun to weep. I was in the consulate at La Guaira, Venezuela, the naturalist recalled, when the consul received the cable announcing Colonel Roosevelt's death. He handed it to me without a word. When I read the message, Cherrie said at last, the tears came to my eyes as they do now. The end.
Well, Candace finished that book hard. Damn, Candace. Ugh.
So, that's the end of the book, River of Doubt. You can see the river, Brent. And, River of Doubt right here. How many miles?
Oh, screw that noise.
And there's a map in the book here. It says Theodore, it was 1,000 miles. Isn't that what they said? I think it
Something
was.
like that. Close to it.
So takeaways, like one of the things that I think is interesting, is tragic, right? Like, Theodore Roosevelt dies a lot earlier. I mean, he could have lived to be 80 for all we know. He was in such good condition, but before the age of penicillin, he has that trolley accident. It gets worse in the jungle. He gets near death, and he never quite gets over it. And pretty much it cut his life a lot shorter.
Well, it ended up being that way. It was a risk that he took, though.
And he was okay with that risk.
Yeah.
He wanted to live a dangerous and daring existence.
I was talking to a friend of mine this last week about, I'm not going to shy away from things just because there's like a risk of, bad things happening.
Well, we talked about it on our earlier podcast. There's life is living scared is not living at all.
Yep.
Like all of
Don't be afraid to go after the things that you want. Just because there's a chance you might get hurt.
I look at all these pandemic lockdowns and all these mask mandates and all this stuff, and it's like we're in danger every day. We get in the car and drive down the road. We live in such
driving is crazy. If you think about it, all that separates you is a tiny line that everyone has just decided to follow the rules
and an
by.
agreement that people will stay on their side of the road.
Yeah, it's insane.
And when you think about it, I look at it. It's like life requires daring to be lived. And it's no life at all to lock yourself inside and then to hide because you might get sick or you might die or something might happen to you. And what's so ironic is you have people stuffing their faces with McDonald's and just garbage and crap and eating poorly and putting things in their body that's certainly much more dangerous than, let's say, something like even getting in a car. I think the statistics of dying from that are much higher than dying from something like being shot with a gun. Right? Or the statistics are much higher than dying even from COVID. And so it's like, why are we why do people live such scared lives, And I think it just comes from being in such a spoiled society. We're so used to being safe that the idea of any danger whatsoever, people just fold.
But at the same time, our safety is an illusion. Well, like if you follow all these rules, then you'll be safe. That's not necessarily true.
Yeah, you look at our grandfather, and he has a bunch of stories he's told, and just even how we grew up. I mean, we took a lot of risks, life risk, but that's part of life. You get on a horse, and you ride horses, and you break a horse. I mean, there's a good chance that horse breaks you.
Yeah, steps on your head.
And yet, there's modern people today who would be like, you can't do that. Like, you need a helmet, and then that's so dangerous. And why, and they're so afraid of everything. And yet there was a time when men were tougher and made of tougher things and had to do tougher things to live. And I think society was better off then. What did you think about about Kermit?
Dang, I knew you were going to ask me that. It sucks. I get that. For me, there's clearly throughout the book, he's an alcoholic.
Yeah.
That's a real struggle for a lot of people. And when you're putting those things into your body, man, you just become the worst thing that is you. I don't think a sober Kermit would have been running around with a bunch of women on a woman he clearly loved. I don't think he would have been, he probably would have served a real military career, not just sitting at a pub, being a wino,
Certainly, giving into the drink, giving into an addiction is part of giving up in a way. Sometimes I think people, addiction is tough. And fighting that is, some people never break free of it, right? Mm-hmm. But there are people who fight it their whole lives, that work really hard to fight it. And you look at, when you read about Kermit's life, 52, I mean, he was around quite a long time after his father passed away. It's a lot of life he lived, and it was pretty meaningless. It seemed like with him, without some sort of dire circumstances, like adventure, some sort of heroic deeds that needed to be performed, that he could not, like when left without an urgent need, he just succumbed to the worst parts of his person, and it's just tragic, he does mirror Elliot. Theodore's brother, Elliot. There's definitely I think a genetic and a family component. The question is how could they have figured out? I mean, he did a better job when Theodore was there helping his son, but when Theodore was gone, he was rudderless. You can just see it if you go and look up Kermit in Wikipedia, or you read about his life, which I did. It's pretty pathetic.
Isn't that what happened to Elliot? Their father passed away, and he just hit the bottle?
Yes. Yeah, when their father passed away, it was over. He just lost it at that point. And same thing. But that can't be it, though. It's like, I mean, at some point, yeah, I understand there's some sorrow at that loss. But I think they were just looking for a reason to give in to the addiction or give in to life, give in to the melancholy. Like, it's their calling. The depression is there, like knocking on the door. They just needed an excuse.
Well, I think everyone who struggles, who, drinks or drugs, they found a solution to their feelings, If I drink enough, or if I drug enough, I don't have to feel a certain way anymore. It's an escape.
It is, but it's such a short-term gain.
For sure.
Such a negative long-term loss. I mean, you're not living life anymore.
No.
You might as well end it.
You're not living a life. You're living the drug. I mean, your life becomes obsessed with just trying to stay okay. I mean, if he's become a real alcoholic, which he has, he's not going to be able to go a day without drinking. Not going to be able to go a couple hours without drinking. That turns you into a weird creature, man. I don't know. I relate a lot to Kermit. I feel that. But
yeah, I feel a lot of sympathy. Well, I have a lot of compassion for his plight. You know, I wasn't born with this sort of tendency. I wasn't born with melancholy. You know, for the most part, I'm a pretty upbeat guy. Just have always been. I haven't had those. I know people I love who struggle with melancholy, sadness, depression, and that's a you know, I don't have that. I don't know what makes it that way, right? But drug abuse only makes it worse. Mm-hmm. It takes something that's already hard and only makes it worse. It only damages people even more, and the people that they love. I look at it though, and I think at what point, what crossroad, what could have been done, what could have made a difference, you know, with Kermit. Because look at a man who had such will and strength and had so many wonderful things about them, so much drive. But the romanticism, the personality, you know, those Roosevelts, they were intense, man.
Mm-hmm.
Intensely
I wonder how much of it,
people.
Man. From my impression of the book, I was not impressed with Belle. Okay, not at all. You know when you work really hard to get something and then you get it and you're like, damn it, this sucks.
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? Because you weren't there and
don't know.
But I do believe that sometimes people get together that are wholly incompatible.
For sure.
And they bring out the worst in each other. And then they both become even like they just become worse. Where people who are compatible that work really well together often have the ability to make their significant other a better person than they are, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. When you're in a marriage where you each make each other better, that's a whole different world than
it's the crab in the buckets.
Mm-hmm.
Sad person pulling the other sad person down. Yeah.
Well, the whole story is almost unbelievable. You know, like all those explorers who like, he didn't do that. No, he didn't. Yeah. No way, you know. Because so many parts along the way, they should have something bad, catastrophic, they should have died, whatever. Mm-hmm. I think it bespeaks of Roosevelt, Rondon, and even Kermit and Cherrie's like nature. They just were like, we are going to do this and we're going to live through it. We're going to find a way. I think that those men together are, and especially Kermit at that stage in his life, working tirelessly, being there, being devoted to his father the way that he was, the willpower that he possessed at that point in his life. I mentioned this before. There are people who have that kind of willpower, and in battle and in war and in harrowing moments, they are the people that just blow your mind. But then when they are put back into normal civilization as a banker,
they struggle.
They find so much meaninglessness in their existence, and they fall into bouts of depression or drug abuse. And so often the people that are heroic in times of war are just deadbeats in normal society. It's tragic because it kind of goes back to meaning and purpose, you know, deriving meaning and purpose from what you do or from life it gives you so much to live for and fight for, But it was a crazy book. I don't want to do the jungle. I'll go to the desert. I'll do a lot of stuff, but the jungle doesn't interest me at all. Mm-mm. Look at that. You just know what's under the water there.
Death, destruction, despair. No. I don't like water. I can't see the bottom of. Dead serious. Not into it.
Yeah.
Even lakes I'm iffy about.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's it for the series. We hope you liked it. Our next book we're going to dive into, we have a couple on the list. I'm not sure which one we're going to go for. I think we're going to do A Higher Call. That's going to be the next book.
Okay.
And I'll let you all know a little more about that in the next series. But thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this. Thanks, Brent, for helping everybody get out of the Amazon.
We finished it.
So, we're trying to crank on these, and we think it's fun and worthwhile, and people enjoy it. If you like what we do us a favor, use that code GRITTY over at Peaks. Get yourself some of those sweet trekking poles. Gators.
Yeah, check the description, guys. There's a bunch of codes.
Yep.
Use them all.
Yep. Ignite, some mountain ops, stealthy nutrition, stealthy rifle cover, all those things. Goat knives. They all help us.
I'm going to go wash this knife for you because you're never going to do
it. All your support helps us keep doing what we do, and we really appreciate it. So thanks a lot, and stay gritty.